Welcome once again to Politics in the Pub, and thank you for coming along. I'm pleased to welcome two distinguished speakers with a lot of experience in education in the public sector. To my immediate left is Gerke, member for Lakemba, who is presently the Shadow Minister for Education in New South Wales. He is the state's first lower house Muslim MP, lower house Muslim MP in the New South Wales Parliament. So at the age of 33, Gerke was appointed Principal of Punchbowl Boys High School, a school that was about to close due to violence and a breakdown in staff-student relationships. But under his leadership, the school made significant improvements in educational and social outcomes for students and the school community through a systematic and practical approach to educational reform. In 2011, Gerke received the Director of New South Wales Public Schools Principal Award. We've also got Jason Gerke. Is it Gerke?
Spot on.
Gerke. Jason Gerke, who is standing in for Maury Mulheron, who was not able to come tonight. But Jason is also highly experienced as an educationalist and as a campaigner for the New South Wales Teachers Federation. He's the professional officer of the New South Wales Teachers Federation. Prior to his election as a city organiser, Jason worked as a high school teacher in public schools across New South Wales in rural remote areas. He's also worked in southwest Sydney. Jason is currently employed at the New South Wales Fair Funding Now campaign as a coordinator. Please welcome Jason to the...
And then I can say I've been a public school teacher before coming into the Teachers Federation, and before being appointed or being given the opportunity to work on the schools funding campaign. I spent most of my teaching in rural New South Wales. I was born in Moree, a small country town in the west of New South Wales. After that, I taught at Gerke Central School, another really small town on the New England Highway, excuse me, before coming to Sydney. And each time I do an acknowledgement of country, I would like to acknowledge the Kamilaroi people on whose land I received that public schooling and on whose land I lived for all of those years. There's one thing that's in common, whether it's in Gerke, whether it's in Gaduga, in Walgett, where our family farm was, or at Westfield Sports High in Fairfield, where I was appointed in my last teaching spot. There's one thing that's in common. There's a public school in every single community. And the funding that is attached to those public schools is something that I've become very, very passionate about. It's quite funny, the Gerke Central School is an enrolment of about 150 kids and a town population of less than 2,000. When I turned up in Fairfield at Westfield Sports High, there's about 1,500 enrolments at the time, so it was quite interesting there to see the similarities and the differences. But as well as the public school being the one constant in all of those communities, there's unfortunately another couple of things that were in common as well. And the disadvantage that's in those communities, the low SES communities that I worked in, the kids that have those individual learning needs, and unfortunately in those days that neoliberalist agenda that we seem to be dealing with more and more often around deregulation, austerity, economic rationalism, and all of that stuff that comes shifting its way into the education field and having a direct impact on the kids is something that I have taken upon myself to always remember, that the impact of political decisions, particularly in education, has that direct impact on the kids in our communities. In 2011, though, that all really began to change when we had the first Gonski, what became known as the Gonski Review in 2011, that recommended that was based on recurrent funding centred on the individual needs of the kid, and unsurprisingly for the profession, that review also found that the current funding arrangements that were contributing to to falling results, to widening achievement gaps between students from different backgrounds and geographic locations. So as I'm sure many of you in the room are aware, teachers, we campaigned right across the country driving that I Give a Gonski campaign that was really had at the heart of it a centralised recurrent funding system that funded kids according to their individual need, and meant that principals, like I'm sure Jihad at the time, meant that they didn't have to every 2 or 3 years prove to a government, a federal government, that they had needs in their schools. It was a bucket of money that was delivered through what was called national partnerships, but every few years they would have to prove that that disadvantage existed. So the big goal, or the big achievement through that original Gonski deal, was that no longer did schools need to prove their disadvantage. It was a direct recognition of the learning needs of kids in those classrooms. And so it came as no surprise to the teaching profession. The initial review also contained in it something called the Schooling Resource Standard, and that's one thing when it comes to funding, and particularly the politics of education in Australia at the moment. It's centred around that Schooling Resource Standard, that each school, they looked at levels of achievement in schools and come up with a formula essentially that mapped schools whether they were essentially above a resource standard or below a resourcing standard, and came up with an agreed methodology of how to place schools on that plane. The original plan was to ensure that the Commonwealth worked with the state and territory governments to obviously make sure all schools were at 100% of their national resourcing, the schooling resource standard. And that's what the heart of why we're fighting still right now. That politicians have got to commit to meeting the needs of every single child in every school, whether it's the kids in Guyra or the kids out in Gaduga, or whether it's kids in Fairfield or Mossman, anywhere. Every child, regardless of their parents' income or their individual circumstances, it shouldn't matter. It doesn't matter. If a kid has a need, and a government has that fundamental responsibility to address that need. The right resources are critical, obviously, for that to occur, and the lack of political commitment, and from the federal government, that lack of political will is something that is absolutely disgraceful, and why we will continue to fight what we're doing. We know that national needs-based funding model is the fair and equitable way to deliver funding to our schools, and as I said, it was recognised in that initial Gonski funding deal back in recommendation back in 2011, and in 2014 it was realised. Our schools were operating on that needs-based funding model that Gonski panel recommended, and one of the biggest deceits of the federal government, or the then federal government, the Abbott and Pyne at the time, is I keep losing track of prime ministers and education ministers lately. It's really difficult. The other constant in all of that, obviously, is our public schools, and certainly us as the Teachers Federation. We've seen out quite a few governments, and we're still here. But one of the biggest deceitful things was this infamous unity ticket before the 2013 federal election that Abbott came out and said, you can vote Liberal, you can vote Labor, but in terms of schools funding, you'll get the same deal. And essentially that was a response to the success and the momentum of the schools funding campaign that we had been driving. What he didn't say, though, at that time before the 2013 election was that what the Gonski recommendations outlined was a 6-year rollout period. And years 5 and 6 of that rollout was supposed to be 2018 and 2019, was also where 2/3 of the total funding needed for the nation's public schools was supposed to be delivered. And that's still where we are now. It was rammed through the Senate. The changes to the funding arrangements last year, the 22nd of June, at about 2 o'clock in the morning, they were rammed through the Senate after quite significant periods of debate. And things got worse. And this is where we're at the moment. So I want to be clear with you what should be happening in our public schools across the country right now. In 2018 and 2019, it should have been the single biggest investment in public schools that the country's schools have ever seen. all of the stuff that was happening. So individual principals, school communities were putting together, in the face of a diminishing centralised support provided by the department, putting together learning programs, support programs, welfare programs, all of the individual programs and initiatives that were coming through the school and being funded, with the trajectory of hopefully it going, the funding being extended, are all being put at risk. The hopes and dreams that some of those programs and initiatives delivered have been essentially knocked on the head. Unilaterally, what that meant when it was ran through the Senate is all of the individual deals that the state government, the federal government had done with the states and territories were torn up. $2.2 billion was the difference in the two funding models. For $1.9 billion of that $2.2 billion was taken from public schools, and that's where it's personal, particularly for us and this campaign. Minister Birmingham talks about levels of record levels of investment, tells us that the Teachers Federation or the AEU, the Australian Education Union, are telling lies and scaremongering and everything else, and we always know that we're on track when we get a rise out of a minister. So but his projections ignore the very real needs that exist in our schools right now. When he talks about record levels of investment, he's talking about the length of the legislation being a 10-year rollout. It was from 2017 to 2027 is the length of that rollout. So he's talking about in 10 years' time. What it ignores is that very real need that exists in our schools right now. And where it gets really, really, really personal is when we look at what's happening with the non-government sector. So that schooling resource standard was to bring all schools to the same level, and then we can have the argument about parent choice, or if you want to fork out 37 or 40 grand to send your kids to somewhere else, then go for it. But let's not go there until all of our schools are funded at least equally by the federal governments. I want to share some stats with you, just in case you're having a good day, or see if we can bring it down a little bit, and we'll see how we go. So the Gonski 2.0 came out. Birmingham and Turnbull's brought out David Gonski on stage to, I guess, essentially confuse and also neutralise that branding and the attachment and the momentum of our I Give a Gonski campaign. $7.1 million. Well, first let me go back. We need to have a little bit of therapy about Simon Birmingham. There were going to be no special deals. The whole thing was too many special deals, there's not enough transparency, I'm going to be open and frank, and the Birmingham-Turnbull deal, there's going to be no special deals. Freedom of information requests, we've already found 107 of the most overfunded private schools in the country, special deals worth $7.1 million just in the last couple of weeks that we've found that information out, aimed at money that was intended for schools that were experiencing diminishing enrolments as a transition fund as they moved on to the new funding mechanism. But essentially we've found a bit of a quid pro quo with those overfunded non-gov schools that were supposed to be knocked down a few notches. We've uncovered a special deal through the Freedom of Information. And that's what we say, how is that fair? Give us some local examples. Banks, the federal electorate of banks, which is one of the ones that we're targeting and looking pretty closely at the moment. This is based on Birmingham's own calculator that he's made it very easy. The more transparent he made it in terms of schools funding calculators, the easier it is for us. Public school student in banks in 2018 receives $3,171 per student of Commonwealth money. The kid in the non-government school across the road receives $9,620 from the federal government. In 2027, at the end of the Birmingham Turnbull government schools funding arrangements, the public school kid goes from $3,171 to $4,800 in a 10-year period. Across the road, in the non-gov sector, $9,620 up to $16,120 per head. How is that fair? Explain to me how that is fair or how that is needs-based. It's a much higher percentage increase for the non-gov sector than what it is for the kid in the public school. Ignores that SRS formula, completely undermines that notion of being needs-based, and the legislation is where it gives the imprimatur for that to happen. So the non-gov schools get 80%. The federal government said we'll fund non-government schools to 80% of that schooling resource standard that we believe schools need to perform to average benchmarks across the state. For the public schools, legislated in our government for the first time ever, a cap on public school funding from the federal government of 20%. 80% for the non-gov school, 20% for the public system, and that's why we've got some serious problems with the politics of education in this country. That arbitrary funding gap means that the funding levels from the schools above the line, essentially, and the disadvantage can never close when they're that fixed indexation rates. Now, I know state schools, public schools receive money from the state government, and that's and I acknowledge that, and it's sometimes a counter-argument that's put to us. But even when that's taken into account, 87% of schools in the country will be funded below that minimum resourcing or that schooling resource standard by 2023. 87% of public schools will never get to that line after 10 years of the Turnbull-Birmingham plan. But 65% of private schools will be above that same entitlement by the same year. And that's when we say, once again, when Turnbull or Birmingham talk to us about needs-based funding, this is the stuff they need to turn around and have a look at and see the kids that it's affecting. Unfortunately, in case there's still a few happy people in the crowd, we have a look at, and I love a good renovation show or some capital works, but the picture doesn't get any better when we look at capital works funding. The non-government sector will also get $2 billion in capital funding over the next 10 years. Meanwhile, the public schools do not get a single cent from the federal government when it comes to capital works funding, not one single cent. So in terms of new science labs, when there's all these STEM and science and technology buzzwords out there, not a single cent. Not a single cent for a new library, for a dilapidated building, for something I'm sure Jihad might mention about air conditioning and hot and sweltering schools. Not a single cent at all, and that's where we've got a problem. ACARA, the Australian Curriculum and Reporting Authority, tell us that the non-gov sector is spending 5 times as much as what the public sector are on capital works, and that's obviously because they are getting so much from the federal government. Recently, in February this year, there was a Sydney Morning Herald editorial that the public are on, and the journalists are on to the federal government. The great con is being exposed. $365 million worth of combined capital developments are in the pipeline for only 7 of the state's most overfunded public schools.
Like that.
No, so it came out of Fairfax too, so we'll see how we go. This happens all the time. Scots College got a $100 million plan in at the moment to develop a Scottish library, because that's what we all need, clearly. And if you want to have a look at the lovely watercolours, you can go on there and have a look. Loretto Currabili already at 287% of the schooling resource standard. Another plan in for a centenary project for 100 mil. But the media are starting to get onto this. The editorial said when schools look like resorts, questions about funding must be asked, and that's quite a fair call. Look, I acknowledge as well that the New South Wales government have made those significant increase in capital funding in their recent budget papers, but it's a partial and an absolute incomplete response to years and years of neglect in terms of capital works funding of our public schools. Quality teaching, it's not just about a rich curriculum and committed teachers. The buildings matter. It's not fair that a kid from Gadooga or from the west of Sydney drives past a Joey's or a Stanley's or a Riverview and sees these most beautiful overspent buildings and then goes into a school that's overrun with demountables. Why should that kid have to have learning conditions like that when the other end of town, based purely on money and greed from federal governments, can experience resorts, as described by journalists. They play a big role. This is off the back to enrolment growth, 23% enrolment growth in the public sector, in the public systems experience is, over the next 10 to 12 years, another 165,000 kids coming in. We need the buildings, and that's why we need that commitment from state and federal governments that there will be some commitment in that area of federal capital funding. But as I said, the good news is it's not being, no one's being fooled. They're onto it. Our polling tells us that when it comes to schools funding, teachers and principals are the most trusted by parents when it comes to telling these stories, and that's given us some great confidence. Look, I just want to finish up to say that I've covered a lot of federal politics at the state level too. There is some state politics in there as well that I want to cover in the 20 seconds or 1 minute that I've got left. There might be a few commas in this last sentence. I mentioned that kind of neo-liberal agenda that had crept into the New South Wales department over the years, and there's been so many functional realignments, rationalisations, restructures, you name it. The department has been hammered, and we are sometimes criticised for, for criticising the department. But what we need is a strong and robust department that supports teachers and therefore allows kids the opportunities that they need. We need, for too long that hasn't been the case, and part of the funding coming federally, I would hope, would assist the department in doing that. And in order to attract and maintain the best and the brightest teachers, we've also got to continue to campaign as a union and as a profession against the state wages cap. The surplus that exists in this state, it's unjust and it's unwarranted for a state government to continue to deny public education teachers salary increases based, or the opportunity to run a work value case in the Industrial Relations Commission. It's simply unacceptable. So that's something we'll continue to campaign for. It's a complete, the government imposing those wages caps, I believe, it undermines the department's capacity to recruit the very teachers that we need. And that's something that we're coming into a state election next year, obviously we'll be looking at very closely. We're building that groundswell of support, and so things are looking good. The campaign is going quite well. We've got 18 targeted seats across the country, 4 of which are in New South Wales in the marginals, and we're on the right track. Public education is that bedrock, I think, of a just and a fair society, and we'll never as a profession or as a campaign remove ourselves from our responsibility to make sure that our most vulnerable and disadvantaged kids are looked after, and certainly in the face of conservative governments and our critics, we will be here for as long as it takes. We're not going anywhere, and big cuts to education require a big response, and that's exactly what we're doing. Thank you very much for your time this evening, and we'll see you on the campaign.
Thank you, Jason.